Hello there, this is Yana for Paper Tray Ink, and thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I will show you how to create stunning Christmas cards you can send to your family and friends, featuring a beautiful heat embossed and watercolored snowflakes backgrounds. I will be using Paper Tray ink pads as my watercolor medium, and will show you how to create stunning backgrounds like this one in no time. So let's get started. I decided to use this gorgeous silver white winters stamp set that features a number of beautiful snowflakes. There are 2 snowflake designs in this set, and each of the 2 designs is available in a few sizes. I really love that there are these large snowflakes included in this set, and you can use them just on their own. The size is pretty good for that, to create beautiful cards. I'm going to start working on my project by arranging these snowflakes on a panel of watercolor paper inside my Misty stamp positioner. You do not have to use this tool to recreate this card design, but if you plan to mass produce these, it sure is very helpful. I've arranged the snowflakes on my panel, and first I placed the largest. Next, I added smaller and smaller snowflakes, and finally filled in the gaps using the smallest images from my set. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to close the door of my Misty and will pick all of these stamps at once. I'm treating my paper with an anti-static powder tool. I know I will be heat embossing these images onto my watercolor panel, and to make sure I don't have any stray embossing powder particles on my finished card, I'm using this powder tool. I've inked up my images using Versamark embossing ink, and I've stamped them onto the panel. I'm making 2 cards today. I will have one with the gold heat embossed snowflakes and one with white heat embossed snowflakes. You can also use silver embossing powder for a background like this one. I'm sure it's going to look stunning. I've added my embossing powder and I've heat set it using my heat tool. Now it's time to add color. I enjoy watercoloring simple backgrounds, so I'm going to watercolor a very easy background for this card. Now with watercolor, you have to remember that it usually does not look that pretty at the beginning. In fact, it oftentimes looks like a hot mess until you come to the very end. So keep this in mind as you watch this video and as you attempt to do your own watercolors. When I watercolor, I often want to throw my painting in the trash, and I wish I'd never started working on it. But as I keep moving forward, and as I keep adding layer upon layer of color, the painting ends up looking much better. So just keep this in mind. I've taped my paper onto the board. This will help my paper remain flat, and it will prevent it from buckling, as I will be adding quite a lot of water to it. If you don't have a board like this, you can tape your paper to any hard surface. If you can pick up the surface as you're coloring, that's even better. I've pulled out a few of my Paper Tray ink pads, and I swatched several that I thought might be a good fit for today's coloring. I made my little chart on the same paper that I have embossed my snowflakes on, so that I was able to see the colors exactly the same way. And the paper I'm using is Arches hot pressed watercolor paper. This is my favorite paper when it comes to stamping and watercoloring. And when it comes to watercolor, your paper is even more important than your watercolors. Even though I will be using ink pads for my coloring, in other words, I will be using a medium that was not designed as a watercolor medium, I will still be able to get great results, mostly due to the paper that I'm using. I love to create deep blue and teal backgrounds, so this is why I picked these particular colors. You can choose to use different palette for your projects and maybe watercolor a soft pink background for the snowflakes. I'm sure that will also look stunning. To do my coloring, I'm going to use a round brush number 8. This is a silver black velvet brush. To be able to pick the color from my ink pads, I have a piece of acetate. I will be pressing my ink pads onto the acetate and will pick up the color from there versus picking it up from the ink pad itself. Let me show you what I mean. So here I used a Aqua Mist ink pad. I pressed it down onto the acetate sheet and was able to transfer a little bit of the ink from the pad onto the acetate. Now I'm able to pick up that color with my brush and transfer it onto my heat embossed background. I've loaded my brush with water. I have a glass full of water sitting on my desk. It's off camera so you can't see it. So my brush is not dry. There's lots of water in it. I'm going to pick up the color from my acetate sheet and will apply it directly onto the panel. I'm loading my brush with more water as I go, and I'm picking up more color and adding more and more of it onto the background. So this is one of the ways to add color onto your background. This is a wet on dry. I picked up wet color and added it onto a dry paper. I'm going to clean up my acetate sheet with a paper towel and will use a heat tool to dry my background. It doesn't have to be 100% dry, but maybe just dry-ish. Now let's add another color to this background, tropical teal. Notice I'm starting to add color from the lightest and will work my way all the way to black. Because watercolor is a transparent medium, you do not want to start with black and then add light blue, as you won't be able to cover up the black. Instead, you want to start by adding light colors and build darker and darker layers on top. This time I'm going to do a wet on wet application. I will pick up a wet color and will add it onto wet paper. To wet the paper, I'm using another brush. This is a flat brush that's about 1 inch wide, and I'm using it to lay down clean, clear water onto the entire background. And then again, I'm using my round brush that is loaded with water, picking up the color from my acetate sheet and applying it onto the background. Because my background is wet, the color that I'm adding now has more time to move and spread on the background. It really is quite magical to watch this, and I never get tired of this. Again, I've cleaned up my acetate sheet and I've added another color, dark indigo. I'm going to dry this layer with my heat tool before applying the next layer of color. So this is all about adding your color in layers and building up layers of color. I've wet the paper once more and again using my round brush that is loaded with water and now adding the dark indigo onto my background. I can also pick up the board and tilt it to either side to help the water and this color move on my paper. I've also mixed up the dark indigo and tropical teal and going to add this mix to my background. The background is actually still wet at this point. I did not dry it, so my new colors can still mix in with the wet colors on the paper. This watercolor process is quite fascinating and oftentimes very unpredictable. What is great about it is no two backgrounds will ever be the same, even if you use the same colors and the same techniques. You can see the 2 cards that I have in my photographs on the blog. I use the same technique and the same colors, yet the backgrounds look very different. Next, I am mixing True Black color and Enchanted Evening, and again, repeating the process. I've dried the paper, I've added water, and now I'm adding the new color, layering it over the previous colors. There's quite a lot of black, but it doesn't look black on my paper. Here I'm using it rather to darken the blue color. My background is still pretty light. I'd like the colors to be darker. To be able to intensify the colors, I've dried my background, and once again I'm going to do a wet on dry coloring. So my paper is dry and I'm adding wet color onto it. You can really see the difference in color intensity because there's no water on my paper. There's A, nothing to move the color, and B, nothing to dilute it. So I'm able to apply it much darker onto my background. I've kept on working on this background until I liked how it looked. I also pulled out my Finetec pearlescent watercolors and added a generous amount of pearlescent white and gold splatter, creating a beautiful mess. I simply loaded my brush with pigment and tapped on it with my finger to add splatter onto the background. The larger the brush you use, and you need to use a round brush for this, by the way, the larger the drops you'll be able to get. So if you want little drops, use a small brush and vice versa. I trimmed my background to 4 by 5¼ inches and foam mounted onto an A2 side folding card base. To create a sentiment for this card, I used a message from the same stamp set, Silver White Winters, and heat embossed it in white embossing powder onto pure poppy cardstock. I trimmed it into a strip and cut a V shape on one end of the strip, and finally foam mounted it onto the card. I did the same thing for my white heat embossed snowflakes card. Finally, I embellished both projects using round confetti in white and gold. While the white snowflakes card looks much better in the photographs, I personally prefer the one with the gold snowflakes as they look much more festive in real life. So here's a closer look at both of these Christmas cards. So even if you don't have the watercolors in your stash, I'd like to encourage you to pull out your paper tray inks, stamps, get some high quality watercolor paper, and give this idea a try. These cards are not hard to make, they are much easier than they look. So this finishes today's video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope I was able to inspire you to create. I will see you next time. Bye!